righty. Hello and good morning. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. While we are allowing all of our viewers to come into the room, thank you for being here this morning. We will get started with a little bit of an introduction for Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum. Good morning. Welcome to the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum's webinar series, where we discover and investigate a range of topics, including aviation, aeronautic innovation, World War II Pacific theater history, and more. Thank you for joining us once again. For those of you who are new here, welcome. Thank you for coming today. Our museum is located in the state of Hawaii on historic Ford Island, right smack dab in the center of the famous Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. It is our mission at our museum to steward the history of America's first aviation battlefield. I am Ashley, and I will be behind the scenes today. We have two very special guests that I will get to just in a moment. But before we begin, everybody who is joining us today, I'd like to alert our viewers about our chat and Q&A capabilities here on Zoom. We're excited to have guests from all over. Could just take a moment right now and enter in the chat where you are viewing from. Thank you so much for joining us. Let us know where you're calling in from, where you're viewing from. But remember that we should always be kind with our comments. We welcome comments and historical notes that we may come up with during our program, but just remember to be kind to one another. Okay, so let's get started. Today we are joined by, of course, our moderator, General Dan Leaf. Welcome again. Thank you for joining us every time we do one of these things.
Oh, hi, Ashley. Always my pleasure.
All right, and our guest speaker today is Rear Admiral Samuel J. Cox, Director of Naval History and Heritage Command. Thank you for joining us today. We're happy to have you. We're actually very excited. A resource that you command all the time here. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
All right, General Leaf, I don't think we should hold our viewers in any suspense any longer. We will just get started right away and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Ashley. Again, pleasure to be here, and I treasure my affiliation with the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum. I'm proud to be on the board, and I love these webinars, especially because of the participation we get online and the great questions and the diversity of locations and viewpoints. So, yay, happy to be here digitally. And I really look forward to learning from Admiral Cox. He's got quite a dream job for a former flag officer as the guardian of Navy history, the illustrious U.S. Navy history. That's cool. And before I toss it over to him, he's going to be our principal speaker. I want to share some things that I think I learned in getting ready for this webinar, and that will also help us answer some of the questions viewers have already submitted in advance. Admiral Cox and I uniquely are both graduates in residence of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. He is a naval officer, me as an airman. We shared a few memories of Fort Leavenworth, Kansas there, but I taught the history of air warfare at Fort Leavenworth for 2 years, and I thought I knew a lot. But looking at salvaging air power, our topic for today's webinar, I learned some more. And here's what I learned as I looked at the U.S. Army Air Forces and the role of land-based air power in the Pacific part of World War II. First of all, the risk of stating the obvious, the aircraft losses on December 7th in Hawaii and December 8th, 8 hours later in the Philippines, were in fact devastating. The numbers are in dispute. You can find different numbers, but generally at least 2/3 of the aircraft down in Oahu were destroyed. And in the Philippines, 12 B-17s and 34 P-40s were taken out of action. We'll talk a little bit about that in the Q&A as I share an online question. But since so many of the airplanes were outmoded, all of the good ones were lost, basically. And that was locally devastating. And yet, a few months later, in the middle of 1942, we were able to generate land-based air power in sufficient quantity and quality to meet the needs of commanders from then to the end of the war. And so my question is, why was that? Well, I think part of it is that the early burden fell largely on carrier-based air. I mean, that was the preponderance of action in wake and midway actions and many of the other operations early in the war. And the U.S. Army Air Force's priorities went to the zone of the interior, the U.S., the Canal Zone, which was a very important consideration, and then, of course, to the European theater. So there wasn't as much demand on the land-based air. But the real reason we did so well has three main parts. In the Air Force, we always think you got to make three main points on any topic. So let me do that. While the attacks were a surprise, the war was not. And to support that assertion, here's what I'll say. In 1941, the Japanese trained 3,000 military pilots. In the same year, the U.S. Army Air Forces and the U.S. Navy trained 11,000. The aircraft production, military aircraft production in Japan, same year, 5,000. US, I'm not sure that all of these were military, but 19,445-ish. That's an incredible difference before December 7th. And then the third main point, so we've got pilots and air crews being trained and the capacity to further increase both. And we've got aircraft production, and most of the aircraft that would be the stalwarts of the war were already flying in production by and large by 1941-42. But just as importantly, the Army Air Forces, in its planning and preparation for the war, had done a number of site surveys, and they knew what to do. And as an airman, I'm used to going someplace and making it our own, if you will, without much notice. I commanded the fighter wing at Aviano when we brought in 8,000 new friends and about 200 new airplanes for the war and coast. So it's kind of in the Air Force's DNA. And in the Pacific, that DNA was really important for going to remote fields, establishing operations, and operating effectively. So we had the capacity to generate aircrew, generate airplanes, and know where to go and how to go there. But we could have done none of that. And now it's my time to turn to Sam Cox and ask him not just about the Navy salvaging air power, but how did the Navy manage to do that at the same time, it conduct its own air power operations and salvage, if you will. At the same time, they were providing the lift to get land-based air to theater. So Sam, enough for me. Let me hand it over to you. And those are things I'm thinking about. What are you thinking about for our audience?
Okay, well, I agree with the premise of your statement there that the attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise, but the war was not.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at U.S. Navy, aircraft carriers at the end of 1942, even after the Battle of Midway, we're down to one operational damaged aircraft carrier in the Pacific. At the end of 1943, we have 6 Essex class carriers and 6 or 7 Independence light carriers. All of those ships that so dramatically turned the tide of the war had been authorized, funded, laid down, and construction started before Pearl Harbor. And along with that was a significant increase in the number of aircraft that were going to go into the Navy. One of the challenges at Pearl Harbor, however, was, there's this idea that, well, the United States was at peace. Well, not really, not for the Navy. We were engaged in a undeclared shooting war with German U-boats off the U.S. East Coast. We were escorting British convoys. Germans got fed up with that, started torpedoing our ship, sank the destroyer Reuben James. Churchill and Roosevelt had already met and agreed that in the event of war, the European theater, defeat Germany first, takes precedence. So in the months before Pearl Harbor, there was a drain of resources from the US Navy in the Pacific, which the Navy had always viewed Japan as our number one potential, enemy. But because of this shift of strategy to the European theater, the three most modernized battleships and one of the four aircraft carriers were sent from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and aircraft reinforcements essentially dried up in the Pacific for much of 1941. There was left three US carriers in the Pacific against, six Japanese fleet carriers, plus a couple medium carriers and smaller ones. So we knowingly put ourselves at a disadvantage with the Japanese because of this decision, which in hindsight, you go, that's a right decision, but it's risky. In terms of, naval aviation, there's two primary components to it relative to Pearl Harbor. One is the land-based piece, which is long-range patrol bombers, in this case, PBY Catalinas. And then there's the aircraft carrier piece of it. And let me address the patrol bombers first, because that was actually critical to the whole Pearl Harbor issue, in that although the Army Air Force was responsible for the defense of Oahu and Pearl Harbor and defense of the ships when they were in port, the Navy was responsible for long-range reconnaissance. And as of 7 December, there were about, depending on which source you will look at, 69 or 71, PBY long-range patrol bombers. All but 15 of them had arrived only in the last 6 weeks. So there's an acute shortage of spare parts. There's an acute shortage of trained pilots. And in December, the weather north of Oahu is terrible. The idea you're going to find a ship, even if you're looking for it up there, is pretty remote. But the Navy was at a severe disadvantage in being able to provide coverage around Pearl Harbor in order to detect an incoming attack. In addition, there was a mountain of intelligence that said the war is going to start. Everyone in position of authority knows it's imminent. All the intelligence indicates it's going to occur in the Far East, Dutch East Indies, Philippines, Malaysia, out there. So, second piece, the US had changed strategy with regard to how the Philippines would be handled, which was a US, not exactly a colony, it was semi-independent, it was kind of in a transition stage, but we had forces there. The war plans assumed for most of the interwar period that the Philippines were indefensible, that we would lose the Philippines, and that the war would consist of the United States going on the offense and going island hopping across the Pacific, and then there'd be a big battle near Japan that would be the decisive action of war, which also happened to be exactly how the Japanese thought it was going to play out. In 1941, the Air Force came up with the idea, well, if we put a lot of strategic bombers in the Philippines, that it might actually change the equation. And so there were B-17s, going out to the Philippines, and they were going via Midway, going via Wake Island. And there was concern that, well, that was potentially at risk to Japanese attack. So, for example, on the morning of Pearl Harbor, before the air attack, there was a Japanese midget submarine that was located by a supply ship, the Antares, and the duty destroyer, the Ward, sank the midget submarine like it was supposed to. Any submarine in that area that was supposed to be sunk, and it did. Well, the Antares was coming from Baker Island, where it had delivered a battalion of U.S. Army engineers in order to develop an airfield there so that the Army strategic bombers could go via a more safer, secure to southern route to the Philippines. But part of that whole program was also to beef up the air defenses on Wake Island and Midway Island. And so it turned out that based on timing, like I said, there were three carriers in the Pacific. The Saratoga was on the West Coast, having completed an overhaul period. So it's only two
Mhm.
out there at Pearl Harbor. And one of them is assigned by national authority to take Marine fighters out to Wake Island, that's the Enterprise. And another one, the Lexington, is to take Marine dive bombers out to Midway Island. So both carriers are on these missions, taking these planes to these islands concurrent with when the Japanese are going to attack. And so Admiral Kimmel, who's the commander in chief of the Pacific Fleet, his fundamental dilemma right then is, do I keep the fleet at sea with no air cover because the carriers are gone? Or do I bring them into port with what he and General Short believed was inadequate air cover? But, if you sink the ships in port, they're not going very far down. If you sink them at sea, you're never getting them back. So he actually put the ships in port. They had a higher air defense plan than would be normal in port, which a lot of people don't realize. Japanese were hoping to catch the carriers in port. By fluke, they weren't there. So the battleships were sunk, but the carriers survived. And each of those carriers, carries about 80 aircraft or so operational. When they're in a transit mode, like when the Saratoga came to Pearl Harbor after the attack, she had 107 aircraft, on board, and started, reinforcing Pearl Harbor. But the point I'm driving at, a couple things is one, when the attack occurred, the Japanese went after the PBY aircraft as a matter of highest priority, because that's what could come out and find them and potentially allow the United States to do a counterattack against their carriers. So the PBYs were at Ford Island, Kanoe Bay, and all of them that weren't airborne were either destroyed or damaged. So by the time the attack was over, there's only about 7 of those PBYs that are even in flyable, condition.
Yeah, the data I have, Sam, I could find it. You can find almost any answer you want looking at real books and on the internet. That only the three airborne truly survived the attack. Everyone on the ground was damaged or destroyed. And
that's correct.
So I'm going to jump ahead, and this is the question from Dennis in Washington. I don't want to disrupt you, but this really has me curious because the PBYs were so important. I like sexy fighters. I'm a fighter pilot, but PBYs were so important. Just 6 months later at Midway, we had 31 PBYs there. Were we building that many PBYs at that time? How do we go from such devastating losses on Ford Island to such a presence at Midway in June of 42?
Yeah, actually, that production program was already well underway. Funded, part of this big naval expansion that actually started before the war. Now, one of the challenges is that right in the immediate months after Pearl Harbor, the German submarines went on an offensive off of our East Coast. So there was this intense demand on those particular types of aircraft. So it took almost until Midway before we started to get, the reinforcements of the PBYs, out there. And then they sent, a bunch of them out to Midway Island. During the Midway campaign, about another 14 operated from Barking Sands in Kauai. But those were nick of time, reinforcements because of the intense demands for those same type of aircraft for the anti-submarine warfare campaign in the Atlantic. But had it not been already a mature, rapidly developed, they were cranking out those planes. And that's what made the difference.
That's like I said, not a surprise. So when the Navy is again, I don't want to interrupt your train of thought too much, but I'm dying to know,
Sure.
to tap your knowledge. When the Navy is moving land-based air to reinforce the Pacifics, first of all, one of the things that's really key is both the Navy and the Army Air Forces are concerned about overcommitting to sites it has to not just defend but also supply, because fuel and bombs aren't infinite and they've got to get them there. But when you're moving land-based air to, on a carrier, as happens sometimes, to an island to put it there, do you totally displace the carrier air wing, or do you just throw on 20 Army airplanes and get them off as soon as possible?
Yeah,
How did that work?
it varied. Generally, they didn't use the big aircraft carriers to carry, Army aircraft. They would have bought
Okay.
Marine aircraft. The Long Beach, which was the first escort carrier, was commissioned just before the start of the war. And there were a couple other were termed the aircraft ferries, which were designed to be able to carry a lot of airplanes. And then like the original US aircraft carrier, the Langley, had been reconfigured as a seaplane tender, but was also pressed into service at carrying Army aircraft. In fact,
Mhm.
she was sunk south of Java during that campaign while trying to get Army P-40s into Java as the Japanese were overrunning it. Uh, but it happened enough that, for example, when the Hornet, the newest aircraft carrier, came around in April for the Doolittle raid, she loaded the 16 Army B-25s in over in San Francisco Bay. And she goes out under the Golden Gate Bridge in broad daylight with 16, Army bombers on board. And
How's your
everyone just
OPSEC?
assumes that she must be ferrying them somewhere because you
Right.
can't launch those things from an aircraft carrier.
Well, she
And,
was
yeah,
ferrying them to their launch point. An amazing
exactly.
story.
But yeah,
Go ahead.
so yeah, and then as the war developed, by the time the end of the war, we built over 100 of those escort carriers. Initially converted merchant hulls, but later on built specifically for it. Although the whole design was still basically a merchant design, but those were used extensively as aircraft ferries for all the services.
Was it possible to conduct combat operations off an escort carrier, or were they only for transport?
No, when they were in a transport mode, they were not combat capable.
Okay,
As was Hornet when she had those bombers on board.
right.
She needed
That
the
was it.
Enterprise with her to provide the air cover because you couldn't operate Navy aircraft with a bunch of bombers on the flight deck.
So I assume that as we look at the salvaging air power, one of the big advantages of the U.S. naval forces was the ability to replenish, repair the ships while at sea and back in port, but also to replenish the air wing and eliminate losses. Was that done from escort carriers? Could you have an escort carrier in the vicinity, if you will, and fly off to a strike carrier and replenish the air wing that way?
Yes, and later in the war, there were actually specific groups of escort carriers identified for that specific role as they were carrying replacement aircraft to replace losses, both operational
Mhm.
and combat, from the big carriers. Now, most of that occurred, 1943 and later.
Right.
Early in the war, everything is running on a shoestring. We were lucky that, both carriers were gone, which meant that both air wings, back then they were called air groups, were
Mhm.
gone. Because when the carrier pulls into port, the air group flies off first, operates from land. And at the time of Pearl Harbor, that would have meant about 80 planes at Ford Island, waiting to get clobbered, when in fact none of them were there because none of the carriers were there. But all the fighter squadrons in particular on both those carriers and on the Saratoga were actually all under strength, because a lot of pilots have been drawn away
Mhm.
because of this massive buildup that was happening. We were training more pilots. You needed pilots to train the pilots. You needed pilots to fly these new airplanes. So it wasn't just the aviation. In fact, all the ships at Pearl Harbor were about 10 to 15% undermanned from the peacetime manning because all these sailors and officers have been sucked away to new construction, to training, and to the combat, in the Pacific.
Sam,
So
could I interrupt because that's such an important point. I'm going to see if I could get my camera to focus on this. Probably not. It's a book, folks. What Training to Fly, Military Flight Training, 1907 to 1945 by Rebecca Hancock Cameron. It's largely about Army Air Forces, and before it, the Signal Corps and the Army Air Corps training. But those challenges of feeding the training pipeline, especially during this massive buildup, they're fascinating in how you do it. So I recommend that book. Another source that was the subject of another online question, is from Larry in South Carolina. Another book I recommend is Craven and Cates, Army Air Forces in World War II. Now it's got 5 volumes of about 900 pages each, so have some time on your hands, but it's tough to find, and that this is your business. You have to do history right because you're the guardian of history of the Navy. It is hard to find definitive data, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm familiar with Craven and Crates because there was a source of my master's thesis at Lebanon, one of them. But yeah, I mean, the more you pull the string on this, all the numbers from Pearl Harbor, how many airplanes, somewhere between 390, 402 total aircraft, how many Navy, 231, 237, 200, you got to take them all with a little bit of grain of salt. And some of it depends on, and even on losses.
Yeah.
Is a plane that was already derelict because he stripped it of parts and is blown up, does that count as destroyed? Or for example, there was a B-24 at Hickam that was going to conduct a special reconnaissance mission over the Marshall Islands in reaction to intelligence on the Japanese buildup there. It was destroyed, but it wasn't part of the Hawaiian Air Force, and most accounts,
Right.
you won't see that plane counted in there. So same
Yeah.
thing, casualty figures, they should all be taken as a approximation of how many people died and were wounded.
The fog of war lasts long after the war. Is my
And it kind of gets
experience.
worse
Yeah.
when secondary sources, start repeating.
Mhm.
Sometimes if you got to go all the way back to the original one, which isn't necessarily authoritative either, because it was based on first reports, which are often wrong.
Yeah.
So it's part of the fun of the job.
It is in trying to reach a reasonable conclusion with as factual information as you get. That's a challenge. I'm going to go to another question from online as we continue. Robert in Indiana said quite a few ships were repurposed after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Can the same be said of the aircraft damage? My answer, you probably know better, is I don't think so. I mean, generally they were viewed more as disposable, certainly, than ships. And any major repairs were complex and time consuming. Plus we had the pipeline of new airplanes. So I don't think aircraft repair was a big part of the post Pearl Harbor, post Luzon attack effort. Am I right or wrong, or do we know?
Yeah, well, I think in post Luzon, it was too late.
Yep.
There wasn't really anything you could do. At least in the case of the Navy, early in the war, they would repair airplanes. Depend on how badly they were damaged. As the war went on, and you start when you start looking at sometimes called a pool on aircraft, that pool, if you will, of Navy carrier aircraft would grow to like 100 airplanes by 1944, 1945. So later in the war, if a plane was damaged, you just shove it over the side because you've got this escort carrier down the road that's got the replacement. And then they'll go back to Pearl Harbor and pick up, more of them. By the end of the war, there were so many. We had the challenge was pilot fatigue more than airplanes, just because we could, so overmatch the Japanese in terms of what we could produce.
Wow. I think a lot about gas because as a fighter pilot, it's important to have fuel, especially over enemy territory. I've been low on gas over bad guy land. It's not a good thing. How big a challenge were the demands for aviation fuel for the carrier air wings? I mean, the ships themselves needed their own power. But how is that accomplished on such a scale where you have so many airplanes flying such heavy, sustained combat operations? Can you
Well, I
talk to
mean,
the
yeah, I
fuel
mean,
piece at all?
early in the war, it's a huge challenge.
Hmm.
A, a lot of it was because of a shortage of tankers more than a shortage of fuel. And fortunately, the Japanese submarines, which are actually really good, but they had this mental model that, torpedoing auxiliaries and merchant ships is not honorable. So they didn't do what we did, which was to clear the ocean of every Japanese tanker and merchant ship. And so some of those ships, a couple of tankers were torpedoed and sunk early in the war, which was a serious problem,
Hmm.
causing the carriers to have to come back early and curtail, operations. But as the war went on, we built so many tankers and so many replenishment ships that, at the end of the war, you have these massive, 3-day long resupply at sea, evolutions, which no other Navy
Wow.
in the world could ever do. And even today, even really only the US Navy can do it to that scale. But just massive numbers of tankers and lots of fuel, and luckily, I mean, it wasn't so much aviation fuel at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese didn't
Right.
go after the fuel storage tanks. A couple reasons. One, if you shoot them up, then you can't see the rest of the targets under the smoke. So if you're going to hit them, you hit them last. And there really appeared to be no Japanese plan to actually take out those tanks.
Hmm.
Just they were so their mindset was so focused on warships,
Well, that
submarines,
replenish, yeah,
airplanes, or take out warships.
again, that's that ability to replenish at sea and simply replenish and resupply the fleet and the land-based air is more evidence, I think, Sam, that we're more prepared than we'd like to give ourselves credit to. And it is a differentiator that has continued to this day. I would submit the big differentiator in U.S. air power today, in addition to great airplanes like the F-35 and the F-18 and the F-22 and are tremendously capable platforms, is the ability to replenish at sea, still a differentiator, but in the air. Nobody else can air refuel like the U.S. And that is an incredible element of flexibility, capability, and range that nobody else has. Let's let me ask you. This is not so much on topic, but it's certainly related. From William in California, a question, Sam. What is your opinion on how successful the Black Shoe Admirals, Fletcher, Kincaid, runs, were as carrier task group commanders in conducting air operations? So they weren't carrier guys, and they ran carrier organizations in combat. Well, we won, so it seems to me they were pretty good. What's the Navy view on that?
Yeah, it was controversial at the time, and you can still start a food fight today, over that.
Mm-hmm.
Admiral Fletcher was in command of the first 3 carrier versus carrier battles in history, and he was not a carrier admiral. And you could say, well, he was 3-0. Others might go, well, it was more like 1-0-2.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases he was really lucky, and he made a lot of mistakes. Um, King wanted Fletcher gone. King was the chief of naval operations and commander in chief of U.S. fleet, so he was he wanted Fletcher gone because one, Battle of Coral Sea, they'd lost to Lexington. which had been King's command. So it was
Mhm.
emotional, traumatic event for him. Plus, we had this um, this, for lack of better, this chauvinistic, arrogant view that Pearl Harbor was a dastardly sneak attack, so it didn't count. And then we won the Battle of Midway decisively. So we're thinking we've got the Japanese on the run. And the Japanese Service Navy, didn't get the memo that the tide of battle had turned at Battle of Midway. So there's another year of absolutely
Right.
just brutal fighting in the Solomon Islands. And we suffer the worst defeat at sea in our history, even after the Battle of Midway. And that kind of, that
Is
gets
that the Savo Strait, I think?
Savo
Savo
Island,
Strait.
where,
Yeah.
the Japanese are in fact really good.
Yep.
And in fact, have technology that is in some cases superior to ours, which we refused to believe at the start of the war. And oh, by
Hubris.
the way, they were incredibly courageous. You call them fanatics or whatever, but I don't. You look at their letters home, and you look at pictures of the kamikaze pilots with a puppy. It's like they're real people. But
Mhm.
they were brave. They were courageous. They fought hard, and it was a tough fight. And yeah,
Yeah, that Fletcher King interaction, and really it's easier to look at the the relationships among admirals because they're more finite and distinct than in the bigger, more smushed together Army Air Forces. But those relationships matter, and past commands matter to admirals and generals.
yeah,
I had I commanded the triple nickel fighter squadron in the Air Force as a lieutenant colonel, and that squadron was under me as a wing commander in combat during Kosovo. And yeah, I paid very close attention to how a guy named Dave Goldfein, later the chief of staff of the Air Force, was running my squadron. He was a great leader. But when he was shot down and rescued, I did put my arm around him when he returned to Aviano and say, "Hey, fingers, I never got shot down when I was a nickel commander." So
yeah.
let's go to,
If I could
go
follow up
ahead.
on that question just a little bit, because
Sure.
another example is Admiral Spruance at the Battle of Philippine Sea, who was heavily criticized by the aviators because he kept the carriers close to where the amphibious operation was going on, because in his mind, that was his mission, was to protect the landings on Tinian, Saipan, and Guam.
Mhm.
Whereas the carrier guys are going, no, our mission is to range all over the Pacific and find the Japanese carriers and sink them. And the end result of that was this long range night recovery after this long strike, where Rich Spruance was heavily criticized. On the other hand,
Mhm.
the losses of aircraft that the Japanese suffered was just catastrophic. Even it did him more damage than losing the aircraft carriers, actually. But then you contrast that with Admiral Halsey at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where he does exactly what the carrier admirals want. He gets intelligence the Japanese carriers are north of Luzon, goes chasing after them, leaves San Bernardino Strait undefended. Japanese surface force comes through, and it's only this miracle battle off Samar that kept those battleships from getting in, turning the Leyte landings into a potential disaster. So, it's, I kind of use that, it's second guessing I'm a historian, so I guess I get to
Yeah.
do it, but I tend to be a lot more sympathetic to the decisions that these guys had to make, because all of them are making them with inadequate, incomplete information, and they're trying to do the best they can with what they've got. And hindsight is always 20/20.
And they only have a preciously small window of time to make those decisions.
Exactly.
So I appreciate your sympathy for them. I share the same. I've made some decisions in combat that in retrospect, I might have done differently, maybe real differently or slightly differently, but crap, you've got to make a decision. most importantly, you have to make a choice. And if you wait for the perfect choice, the opportunity to choose has passed already.
Exactly.
Wow. I have so much to talk about. The one of the areas of interest for the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, of course, is airplanes. And we've talked about how most of the airplanes were in development and in fact in production that served prominent roles in the Pacific. But Leslie in California asked a question. And by the way, folks, Ford and Spin are answering your questions in the Q&A session on Zoom. We've got some that were submitted. This is one of those submitted. So the question that we got from Leslie in California, Sam, was, were the Hellcat, which first flew in June of 42, and the Mustang, which flew earlier, October of 1940, considered the post-Pearl Harbor fighter upgrades? And can you explain improvements made on those to those aircraft over the ones in use on December 7th, 1941? The reason I picked this one out, Sam, is it's a really interesting question. The Mustang was further in development. It was kind of a broader development, fighter / bomber escort, a lot of improvement over everything. Really, it's a beautiful airplane. I've flown it a few times. But the Hellcat, during its development, was in fact specifically adapted to meet the Japanese threat, right?
That's correct. Although it was conceived
Yeah.
before the war, and it was conceived at a time when there actually was intelligence, much of it courtesy of Chenault, about the Zero, if you will, A6M fighter. So we had more intelligence than we made use of, to be honest. You know, at the start of the war, the Navy had two fighters. The newer one was the F-4F Wildcat. The slightly older one was called the Brewster Buffalo. Buffalo had all kinds of problems, struts collapsed and whatnot, and then wound up, you know, getting slaughtered at Midway. So it's probably unfortunate we didn't pull it, you know, even sooner. The Japanese carrier fighter, the you know, code name was Zeke, but everyone called it the Zero. Was faster, more maneuverable, longer range, and with really good pilots than the Wildcat. But the Wildcat had more powerful armament, better armor, and if used correctly in a you know, get altitude advantage, hit and run. You know, don't ever dogfight with a Zero because you're toast. It, you know, it could hold its own with an experienced pilot. The Hellcat fixed, you know, essentially was as maneuverable and faster, higher rate of climb, more powerful armament than the Zero. Zero, big problem, didn't have self-sealing gas tanks.
Right.
The Wildcat did and the Hellcat did. So if you hit a Zero, it was going to turn into a torch. Whereas you could shoot holes within a Wildcat, and you know, if the Zero had 7.7 millimeter and then 20 millimeter cannons, it was easier to hit something with the 7.7, but that wouldn't bring generally a Wildcat down unless you hit the pilot, you know, in the head. 20 millimeters would, but it was harder to hit the plane with those. But the Wildcat, or the Hellcat, you know, was so much superior to the Wildcat, and as superior in many respects in maneuverability to the Zero. Plus it was more survivable than the Zero. And as our pilots became more experienced, another difference in philosophy is that we kept our good pilots in the forward area only so long, and then they went back to train the new ones. And so next generations of US Navy pilots are having the advantage of the Butch O'Hares and the Thatches and the Flatleys and whatnot. Whereas the Japanese keep their best pilots in the forward area until they're dead.
In some measure by necessity because of the losses they're taking,
part
right?
of it, but you know, so there's no one to train the next generation of pilots. So Japanese pilot quality goes way down.
Right.
US pilots, you know, you know, the average, by the end of the war, the average US pilot, Navy and Air Force is way better than the average Japanese pilot. There's still some good Japanese pilots at the end that will occasionally
Mhm.
surprise some cocky Hellcat pilot with, oh, this guy's actually good. Yeah.
Yeah, those are bad surprises. One of the areas that the U.S. Army Air Forces advanced significantly in during the war was gunnery, aerial gunnery, because there wasn't a body of knowledge that really understood pursuit / fighter gunnery. And I think it's Dick Bong, the ace of aces with 40 kills, another Wisconsin native like me, who remarked about how many more airplanes he could have shot down had he known how to shoot beforehand. Was that a similar training experience for the Navy? You're in a little different environment, learning on the fly, so to speak, within your carrier unit. But was gunnery a big area for development?
Yeah, it was. And some, pilots like Butch O'Hare were very much ahead of the pack in terms of their thinking on
Yeah.
how to do this. At the start of the war, though, there was basically insufficient opportunity to practice gunnery, real gunnery, not
Mhm.
only for the airplanes, but for the ships. Although we're building all this new stuff, there's still this interwar budget mentality that live fire training was actually very rare. So, Pearl Harbor is a real shock when most of the anti-aircraft rounds turned out to be duds.
Yeah.
That's an unpleasant surprise when you're in the middle of a battle. And the same thing, the pilots in the early phases of the war were constantly complaining about not having enough time to practice, gunnery.
And you see that in a lot of the footage. I can't, yeah, I'm a kind of an aviation video addict, and I watch a lot of the gunnery. Come on, man, pull some more lead. And the live fire training, you talked about your master's thesis at Leavenworth. I did the same program, a lot of interconnectivity. And I wrote mine on the air-to-air missile training program, live fire missile training, because we keep learning that you have to make sure the weapons are ready, and the employers of weapons, pilots and aircrew and ground gunners or ship-based gunners are ready. And it's not something, there's a great value in simulator training these days, but it's something you have to experience and develop a touch for, if you will. Ashley prompted me 2 minutes ago that it's time for Q&A. We've talked about some of the ones that have been sent in. I'd like to invite now for some more questions on our Q&A window on Zoom. If you type those in, and Sam, if you've got the window open, or I can read them to you, we'll go through and answer any of the incoming ones. So as we wait for another one, let me pull one up from the previous selected ones. I'm not going to answer Doug from North Carolina, who asked was John Finn portrayed in Tora, because I don't know who John Finn is, and I ran out of time. Do you? Okay, so who is John Finn, Sam? You bailed me out, man.
John Finn was a chief ordnanceman at the Kaneohe. And during the first and second attack, he wound up manning a machine gun out in the open, and he's shooting at the Japanese. He wound up with a Medal of Honor for his courage in doing that. Whether he hit any airplanes, the same thing with Doris Miller. Another
right.
incident. His story's been somewhat embellished over the years, but he still was shooting a weapon he wasn't trained to shoot. And
yeah, exactly. And if you want to criticize, let me know when you've stood up to that.
The Japanese post-action report from Pearl Harbor basically said, Nagumo's report said the volume of anti-aircraft fire caught the Japanese by surprise. They said, within 5 minutes of the start of the attack, the volume of fire had essentially negated the element of surprise. And the problem was that the
Interesting.
weapons were inadequate. It
Mhm.
wasn't because the sailors weren't trained. It wasn't because they couldn't put up a ton of fire really
Lead.
quick. It was just, there was nothing that could bring down a torpedo bomber or dive bomber before weapons release. Uh, and
Based on caliber,
yeah, well, but the elevation, sight,
range.
dud rounds, for a whole lot of factors that, if you look at, well, what's the real reason why more Japanese aircraft weren't lost? And when you look at the damage, almost 50% of the Japanese strike is either lost or damaged. Very
Yep.
relatively few are lost, but a lot of them got hit.
Right.
But the weapons couldn't bring them down.
And there's a lot of debate about the potential for a third wave attack. And part of the thinking is believed to be that they took more than 2/3 of their losses during the attacks were in the second wave. So it got significantly more dangerous. Hey, Spin is working our Q&A question. So if you get another question, let us try to answer. There's one. Will you have another presentation such as this in the future? Yes, we've got a series of webinars planned, so stay tuned for that. So back to the submitted Q&As, and I'm watching our window to hope we get some live ones. There was a question about why the aircraft were caught on the ground in the Philippines and Luzon, and we had 10 hours warning sort of from the attack on Pearl Harbor. So I did some research, and they weren't really caught on the ground. There was an attempt to get airborne. Some airplanes got airborne. There was a planned strike on the bases of the southern end of Formosa, now known as Taiwan. But they got unlucky. They were outnumbered, seriously outnumbered. It was a massive strike on Clark in terms of numbers. They were outgunned, and timing sucked. So interestingly, but I wouldn't say they're blameless. Perhaps they could have done more in terms of dispersal, but there was no investigation into what happened on Luzon as there was with regard to Pearl Harbor. Okay, pending any other questions, Sam, go ahead. Go ahead, Sam, sorry.
There's the simplistic notion is that, well, MacArthur was an idiot, but it was actually way more nuanced than that, in the sense that the fighters went up and were ready for when they expected Japanese attack should have come. But because of fog in Formosa, the Japanese weren't able to launch when they planned to launch. And so a lot of our aircraft are actually running out of fuel and actually have landed back at Clark Airfield when the Japanese finally show up. And so that was a significant factor as well. And then, the P-36s, they're no match for a Zero. A P-40 with a really good pilot, could hold its own, but
they did not have the experience that the Japanese had. They had a better airplane. They had the initiative. We do have a couple questions that we're getting in chat, thanks to Ashley. I'd like to address one, Sam, and then turn to yours. The question from Debbie is, how did Maui and its airfields fit into the training after the attack? And I'll address that by saying, in April, we hope we'll have a new display at the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum that addresses that specifically. I'm really excited about the importance of that local story in the Pacific War. So stay tuned. Here's one that I'll toss to you, Sam, because I have no idea about the answer. From Monica. I'm interested in knowing more about the role of the PB-4Y privateers in 1945 in the last few months of the war in the South Pacific. Do you know much about the privateer and its role, sir?
Well, some. The privateer is. The original ones it's a B-24.
Right.
And in later versions of it went from a twin tail to a single tail, but it's essentially a Navy version of a B-24. And they actually were later in the war were very active in search and rescue, and they couldn't land in the water, but for reconnaissance and whatnot.
Mhm.
I'm not too familiar with their combat role late in the war. Again, they were generally long-range reconnaissance is what their mission was. They didn't engage in bombing of Japan at the, they may have been involved in the mine laying to some degree. But yeah, I don't know that much about it. And back to Maui is at one of those airfields, Puanimi, however you pronounce it.
Yeah, I did not attempt to pronounce Pua.
Yeah, at one point that was the
Sorry.
largest naval air station in the world
Yeah.
for a brief period, because that's where the Navy SX class carriers would put their whole air group ashore there. I mean, there's massive numbers of airplanes, and then the pilots would all go up to some ranch and write their names on the wall there. And that wall is now at the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola with 20,000 Navy pilots' autographs, on this wall during the war.
20,000. Unbelievable. In my flying training book, the numbers are the magnitude of this war. And now we're looking at Ukraine and Russia thinking, well, that's potentially a big war, but that is potentially a big war. But the training numbers from 1939 to 1945, roughly 200,000 pilots, 200,000 Army Air Forces. That's a lot. It's unbelievable. But we have the capacity for that, both in human capacity and the training infrastructure to do it. So Ashley, I see you're coming back on to bring this to an end. Hey, before you do that, before I toss to you, Admiral Cox, Sam, really great to have a chance to share this with you. I'd love to sit down and have a coffee, or maybe, can I say cold beer on a webinar with you and learn more. So when I get back your way, I'll look you up. But thanks so much for your commitment to Navy history, to U.S. military history, and sharing your time with the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum. I really appreciate it. Mahalo.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. I wanted to add in just before we get in, the pronunciation of that airfield is Pu'unene. So that's where
Show off.
my expertise. And that wall that we're talking about, that's the Von Tempsky wall. And I see in our viewership that Debbie Von Tempsky is with us. So I believe that is a family member, descendant of that ranch up in Maui. So I did
Wow.
want to put out a recognition there. But yes, thank you both for joining us. Fig, thank you so much for moderating as
Pleasure always.
your skill. Excellent moving along. And Admiral Cox, I don't think anybody had time to put in questions from the beginning because they were enraptured the entire time. And I saw the longest questions being thrown in at the very end. I know we're going to have a lot of emails in asking if you can answer those questions later, but I do hope that you come join us again and have just another lovely conversation where we get to learn everything that you know and ask you so much more questions if you're up for it. We hope you join us again. But thank you. Yes.
It was fun.
Good. That's the idea.
Glad you had a good time.
Beats working. I'm not in the office.
Oh, anytime you want to come visit us here in Hawaii again, and we'll do this live, and that'll be even better. Get yourself a vacation.
All right. Thanks.
Yes, so thank you all for joining us here at the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum webinar series. Thank you for joining us. I want you all to know that we cannot do this without your viewership and all of your questions. If you have the opportunity to stop by our museum, we are open. Come visit us, and very soon you'll be able to join us up this tower that you can see in my background. We'll be doing high aerial views of the Ford Island battlefield. So please do come visit us when you can. And thank you all for making the time this morning and here in Hawaii and all around the world. I saw people all around the world joining us.
Yep. Very cool.
But thank you all so much. Mahalo, mahalo, and join us again next time. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Aloha.